complicated relationship. Saul's heart is troubled because he's jealous of David's success. One day he loves him, the next day he desires to kill him. And David by now is also married to Saul's daughter, Michal. And so he's now the son-in-law to the king. But David's closest relationship is with Saul's son, Jonathan. And Scripture records that the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David. Now Saul and his sons, including Jonathan, he had 3 sons, including Jonathan, had gone up to Mount Gilboa to battle the Philistines. And in the course of that battle, Saul and his sons were killed. And Saul, mortally wounded, fell upon his own sword. Several days later, the news of the death of Saul and Jonathan reached David. And in the words of our text this morning from 2 Samuel, David expresses his deep lament for Saul and Jonathan. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places. How the mighty have fallen. And the depth of David's pain and anguish and despair is laid out for everyone to hear. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. It doesn't matter that what David says isn't really all true. Saul and Jonathan were often divided, and most frequently over David. Saul wanted to kill him in jealous fits of rage, and Jonathan risked his own life to save his beloved friend. But we know that in death, in the eulogies that we say about people, in our times of lament, it's common to highlight the best qualities. I remember a couple of sisters came up to me years ago and said, our father has died, and he had a tenuous connection with the church where I was serving. And they said, could you please do the funeral? And I said, I would, but would you tell me a little bit about him? And they said, well, we haven't seen him for many, many years because we've been estranged from him. He was not a nice man. He wasn't nice to our mother. He wasn't nice to us. He had no part in our lives for the past 20, 30 years. It wasn't until about a year ago that we reconnected with him. He was very sick at that point. We can't really tell you much good about him. But could you please say something nice? It's common in our times of lament, in our eulogies, to be gracious about people after they've died, right? It's common to be gracious about their faults. But again, David's grief is impossible to miss. How the mighty have fallen. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perish. Right? This is a raw, emotional, bare grief, poured out in public lament, in view of everyone to see and hear. And it's not the kind of thing that we see too often from our present-day leaders, is it? These days, we see people in leadership who believe that vulnerability is weakness. Vulnerability is weakness. That any act that might seem to be seen as soft or timid needs to be avoided at all costs. Today, as we mark Canada Day, my fear is that the political and social climate of our time seems dangerously reminiscent of an earlier era in which brave men and women had to fight and die to defend our nation and the cause of freedom from those who would threaten to take it from us. You know, that time too was an era where a growing sense of nativism and nationalism led to protectionism, xenophobia, and ultimately conflict, war. The trend across the nations of the world today is unmistakable. Whether in response to the political realities of the United States or not, It's unmistakable that more and more nations are electing leaders that seek to promote their own agenda above all else, forgetting that the system of political and economic interdependence that was purposefully built and shaped after the Second World War was constructed so that the very threat of conflict, the very threat of destruction, might be avoided if these nations were interconnected and had to work with one another, had to depend on one another. And it seems to me that that era of interdependence and cooperation might be coming to a close. When's the last time? When is the last time you saw a world leader show a level of vulnerability in public? You won't see it from the current US president, right? He's not going to be vulnerable in public. I'm not sure he's vulnerable in private. And when our leaders won't show vulnerability, it only makes sense then that those who follow them, those who support them, will feel emboldened to act out from their own positions of strength. Now, I have to say, in all fairness, in the aftermath of wide-scale tragedies like the Humboldt bus disaster, the people that were killed on Yonge Street, or any of the far too numerous mass shootings in the United States, there is always an outpouring of support, compassion, and sympathy. But I also think that there is a growing callousness to the ongoing day after day suffering of others that don't merit the kind of headline news coverage that some of these great tragedies do. I think that this lack of public grief is indicative of a larger issue in our culture. We live lives that are more and more isolated and anesthetized from the struggles and the pain of our common life together. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the realities for us today is that war is, for the vast majority of us, something very, very different than what it used to be. Many of you here know what war was like. Many others of us here have no idea what war was like, what war is like. Kings don't go into battle with their troops like they used to. The closest that our kings of our time ever get into battle might be to watch a laser-guided missile destroy its target from a satellite feed. Or to watch as an unmanned drone is sent to do what in the past it took soldiers, people, to do. And even though from time to time we are horrified when we hear about stories of terrorism and the soldiers who do go out into combat, many of them who are left with PTSD, unable to function again fully in our society, our horror about war, I just think doesn't last. And it's replaced with indifference or even a willful ignorance. I don't want to know. I don't want to know because, well, how much can you know? How much can one know? There's a sense of willful ignorance about this. But I think for some, especially those soldiers who do serve in their families, and those who are powerless, who are the victims of war, the horror of war is very real and very, very personal. I remember listening to Alex Ness, who was the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. He was describing what it was like to live in a war zone in southern Sudan, when it was fighting for independence from the government of northern Sudan and the despotic totalitarian ruler Omar al-Bashir. The government forces would seal off people from all contact, from journalists who would seek to report on them, and even from receiving aid from organizations like Presbyterian World Service and Development, World Vision, or even the United Nations. In these places, tens of thousands of people were at risk every day, not knowing whether the next bomb would hit them or hit someone that they loved. Barrel bombs and outlawed cluster bombs were dropped regularly on people from low-flying bombers. Hospitals were targeted. Schools were targeted. People slept ever mindful of where they were and how close they were to the nearest foxhole that they could dive under when the next bombing started. And sadly, In the aftermath of the hard-fought independence in southern Sudan, now the fighting is between the southern Sudanese themselves along tribal lines. Some of the refugee camps in South Sudan are so large that one is now the third largest city in southern Sudan, growing by 2,500 people a week. This is the reality of war on the ground. People in places like South Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and so many other war-ravaged places. These people know what war is, the terror and the horror of war on an intimate basis. Everyone has been impacted by the senselessness, the violence of war, either directly or in their immediate family. Maybe if the horror of war was as real, as intimate to our kings, to us, as they are to those who are helplessly caught up in it, maybe then we would have more passion to work for peace, to advocate for a lasting, equitable peace. The mighty no longer fall in battle these days. And that distance from the immediate danger runs the risk of disconnecting us from our ability to grieve or to lament. You know, there's another culprit towards our tendency of social isolation. You know, our neighborhoods are not designed to encourage people to get to know one another. We can live in our homes now for years and not get to know our neighbors. And the gadgetry, the technology that we have, promotes the ability for us to have hundreds or thousands of online friends and not one single real friend in the flesh of substance. I read about a phenomenon called ghosting. How many of you know about ghosting? The younger ones, or the ones that are young at heart, know what ghosting's all about. It's when you don't want to have to tell someone that you don't like them anymore, or that the relationship is over, or you're just not interested in being their friend. In the old days, you would have to go and say, hey, I need to talk to you. You know, let's say you wanted to break up with someone. It would be that painful, horrible conversation where you would actually have to meet with someone face to face and say, it's not you, it's me. Or something like that, right? You'd have to talk to people. It was difficult and painful. But now with so many of our interactions taking place online, through emails and texts and tweets and through Facebook, you can ghost someone that you don't want to see again by deleting all of their contact information, by blocking them from your information, by not answering their emails, texts, or friend requests. It's like you make them disappear from your world, or more accurately, you have disappeared from their world. You're like a ghost. There's no more need for the decency of a face-to-face discussion. You just turn into a ghost. Delete. What David's lament reminds us is that when our relationships are shallow and superficial, when our connection to the most important facets of our common life together is only at a distance, our ability to connect and our ability to grieve in times of trouble, pain, and suffering will also be shallow and insufficient. To be able to grieve, to be able to lament, this is a basic human need. It's in the way that we're wired and in the way that we're created. We have to be able to express our deepest hurts and pain. And in our expression of that pain, that hurt, that grief, we find hope and healing in God and in the community of God's people who will hold us, comfort us, walk with us, and love us. Think of the relationship between David and Jonathan. It's remarkable. It's remarkable how Scripture describes this relationship. The depth of their connection to one another is such that Scripture says that their souls were bound to each other. Their souls were bound to each other. How many of our relationships could be described as having that depth of meaning? How many of our relationships could be described that our souls were bound to each other? Beyond immediate family, are there others, are there friends to whom your souls are bound? Are there people to whom your souls are bound? Do we dare risk loving at this depth, to be bound in our souls to others? Do we dare? Because you just can't ghost someone to whom your souls are bound. You don't just walk away. You can't pretend it never happened. To love at that level of depth is to risk everything. Would we risk this sort of friendship in our lives? Even to the point of knowing how difficult losing such friends would be. To not know this level of risk, to not know this depth of loss, is to be safe and protected from lamented grief. And it's to lose knowing something that is so core to the heart of God. It's to lose knowing something that is so core to the heart of God. David's lament gives voice to the horror of war and the intimate pain of immeasurable loss. In a culture where there is so much muteness around our grief and our loss, so much muteness because our culture is more and more at a loss for words, for something meaningful and hopeful to say. Is it our calling? Is it our calling, friends? As those who worship and serve a God whose own Son was given to us as an act of incalculable love, and whose death brought such immeasurable pain, is it our calling as the people of that God, as the people of faith, to give voice to our grief and our loss, so that we can also give voice to our faith and our hope in the one who brings resurrection, who brings healing, who brings wholeness, and who brings hope? Speaking of presence and vulnerability, or rather the lack of it, I have to actually go back a few years to find an example of a leader who would be strong enough to show public grief and vulnerability. Maybe you remember President Obama back in 2015. During his eulogy for those 9 people that were killed by a shooter in the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charlotte, South Carolina, they were killed by a 21-year-old white supremacist named Dylann Roof. And in that eulogy, Obama said that blinded by hatred, the alleged killer could not have anticipated the way that the families of the victims would respond as they saw him in court. In the midst of unspeakable grief, they responded with words of forgiveness. Then at the end of the eulogy, Obama broke into a song. He sang Amazing Grace. Do you remember that? The courage and the ability to engage in an act of public grief and lament. The love of this congregation for one another, for whom they love with all their souls. The faith of a people who could forgive even such a horrific act of violence and hatred. These words spoken publicly in the midst of grief, they also allow for a witness, don't they? Pointing to someone, something beyond ourselves, to a hope that keeps us going, a healing that holds us together, a promise that one day all of us will be made whole. Obama ended by saying, as a nation, out of this terrible tragedy, God has visited grace upon us, for He has allowed us to see where we've been blind. God has given us the chance where we've been lost to find our best selves. Don't you long for that kind of vulnerability? Don't you long for that kind of strength from our leaders? But just as the former president's eulogy moved beyond just grief for the victims and into a conversation about race and hatred, so David's eulogy for Saul and Jonathan also moves us beyond just grief and calls us to examine the futility of war, the weapons of war, and to uphold the value of loving relationships that call us to risk more, to risk everything. So who is it for you? Who is it for you that challenges your willingness to move beyond self-protection to a level of vulnerability that maybe you aren't comfortable with? Who is that for you that would move you to that level of vulnerability that you're not going to be comfortable with? Is it the illegal migrants that show up at our borders? Do you just think, why don't they just do it legally? Is it the homeless person about whom you wonder, why don't they just get a job? They look like they're young, they're strong enough, why don't they just get a job? Is it the neighbor that you really don't know well, but you suspect holds different values from you? I wonder what their agenda is. Is it the person whose sexual orientation is different from yours? Who is it that threatens your sense of self-protection and would leave you vulnerable? It's hard enough for us to risk loving those we know. How hard is it going to be for us to risk loving those we don't know? So maybe the story for us today tells us that we've got to be willing to risk more, so that we can know people at a deeper level, so that we can know their stories and their struggles and their hopes, their desires, so that they don't remain just strangers, but might become friends. Will we engage with one another and with those causes in our common community at a depth that will put us at risk? Will we engage at that level? Will we love people, not only our families, but our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, our co-workers, sometimes even those we just don't know that well, maybe even our enemies? Will we love them with our whole souls? And if we will, can you imagine what our communities and our world might look like? Can you imagine a world where the ones who follow Jesus are as engaged and love the world as Jesus did? Where the ones who would be disciples of Jesus Christ would seek justice, compassion, and grace for all people, like Jesus did? Can you imagine loving and caring so much that it hurts, so that when it hurts, we can speak of the healing, the hope, and the love of God? Friends, I hope we can imagine it, because I know that that's what God imagines for us. Thanks be to God.